Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello. The shooting down of a Syrian jet by Turkey this weekend is a reminder of the volatility of a region that's rarely out of the news. The Arab Spring brought about less new hope than fresh crises. But how did we get here, and can the past guide us forwards? To disentangle the making of the modern Middle East, I'm joined at the table today by Ali Allawi, a former minister in the post-war government in Iraq. He's written about the leader who forged Iraq in the wake of World War I, King Faisal. With us too is Scott Anderson, a veteran war correspondent who's taken a fresh look at Faisal's contemporary, Lawrence of Arabia. Malu Halasa has curated an exhibition on Syria's art of resistance, including the potently rude comic strip. And should the bewildering kaleidoscope of today's Middle East attract us to the fashionable what-if approach to history writing? The historian Richard Evans will be taking on counterfactual history. Scott Anderson, first to you, Lawrence of Arabia, deceit, imperial folly and the making of the modern Middle East. How did an outsider become such a decisive player in that part of the world?
Lawrence was uniquely suited to what he walked into with the Arab Revolt. He had spent a lot of time in northern Syria on an archaeological dig, and had really studied. Even more than an archaeologist, he was a cultural anthropologist. He'd really studied the tribal and clan structure of the Arab society, and he'd also during his days at Oxford, he was fascinated with medieval military history. And when the Arab Revolt started,
this is the Arab Revolt against the Ottoman Empire.
That's right, in 1916, and he went over within a few months after the revolt had started. And I think far more than any other British officer at the time, who was when the revolt started, he intuitively understood how you would wage war in that part of the world.
And he's a reasonably junior character, and I think one thesis of your book is the way that these slightly peripheral characters, often starting out at the end of their 20s, end up remaking the map.
That's right. And of course, this was in the midst of World War I, and certainly for the British and the French, their primary focus was what was happening on the Western Front. So on the periphery, in these secondary and tertiary battlefronts, like the Middle East, a man like Lawrence had tremendous freedom of movement, freedom of action, and so if he could go off to Arabia and help unite the Arab tribes to fight the Turkish enemy, he was given great freedom to do so.
And he also had, we talk about global power play in the Middle East today, and to what extent the great powers can be blamed, or at least what happens is attributed to them. He also had the Americans in the mix.
That's right. The Americans. There was one of the characters in my book is a man named William Yale.
I'm pleased you mentioned him. He's absolutely fascinating, dashing man.
He went over for Standard Oil of New York to oil prospect, and of course the Americans didn't come into World War I until 1917. So until 1917, he sat in Jerusalem protecting the oil concessions for Standard Oil of New York. When the Americans came into the war, he had to leave Jerusalem. He came back to the region as the only American field intelligence officer in the Middle East during World War I, while still secretly on the payroll of Standard Oil.
A very wise move, perhaps. But it is interesting, isn't it? It's very young people who then start pitching in. But Ali Allawi, if I could bring you in there, I mean, what about Faisal's relationship with Lawrence at that time? Because there is a man who is very proud, very much in his own territory, has a very clear idea how he wants to develop an Arab identity.
Well, I think the relationship between the two is waxed and waned, as it were. But in the early days, at the beginning of the Arab Revolt, Emir Faisal, or Prince Faisal, had a definite need for Lawrence, because he was really unfamiliar with international relations. He was unfamiliar with the demands of the British in Cairo, who was supporting militarily and logistically the Arab Revolt. So what
was the nature of their relationship, their personal relationship? Because reading your book, you got the sense, as you say, it waxed and waned. It was a bit on off, and sometimes he felt rather patronised by this incomer.
I think that is the case, in the sense that he was his own man, but in the early days he did need the advice and support of people who were more familiar with the, as it were, with the international landscape. But as time went on, as he became more familiar, confident, and so on, his need for Lawrence changed, and he moved from being an advisor to being more of a friend, and in some ways a dispensable friend, I would say. But Lawrence nevertheless thought of him as a kind of project that he was building him up in a way that he would have wanted to see the leader emerge in that form. So there was, I would assume, a kind of disconnect between Faisal's own perceptions as to his role as leader and future king of both Syria and Iraq, as well as and the way that he was visualized, or the role that he was assigned, as it were, by the British, and Lawrence in particular, who had an important influence on policy making in Cairo.
Scott, it was only after the war that the imperial powers then stepped in, carved up the Middle East, began to make a map that we can begin to recognise today, and the likes of Lawrence then become rather marginalised, don't they?
That's right. Lawrence went to the Paris Peace Conference as a liaison for Faisal, and rather desperately tried to figure out some force at Paris that would honor the promises that had been made to the Arabs. Of course, first appealing to his own government, the British government, realized he wasn't going to get anywhere with the French, but also appealed to the Americans, and most famously engineered Faisal to make a deal with the Zionists in the Weizmann-Faisal agreement, which in return for recognition of Jewish primacy in Palestine, the Zionists would support Syrian independence for the Arabs. I think that both men were desperately trying to figure out some way that the great powers would stand up to the promise, would stand by the promises been made. And gradually, the British power structure saw Lawrence as the enemy within, to the point where he was pretty much banned from Paris and barred from talking with Faisal when Faisal came back to Paris and London. So Lawrence just kind of went off.
Let the big guys in now,
Yep.
chaps.
Yeah.
Your day is done. And we often talk, Ali, about the extraordinary immersion of T. Lawrence in Arab culture. We don't think so much the other way around. And one of the things that a chapter I particularly enjoyed in your book is the way that Faisal, when he sets off and comes to the peace conference, comes to Paris, he's ill at ease, he's pushed out, really. It takes quite a lot of manoeuvring to even get him to the table, and then he comes on to London where he wants to be accepted, and he starts wearing frock coats, and he thinks that's the right thing to do. He doesn't see it as bending in any way to the colonial masters.
No, I mean, he had to. I mean, he thought, as I said earlier, he had a learning curve to go through, as it were, in terms of how to deal with Western powers and how to deal in the forums of international diplomacy. So the way that he changed his clothes and so on are really part of that. He wasn't really trying to, as it were, fit in. He wanted to reflect that he was a leader of a country or region that had full right to be within the Committee of Nations, as it were, that was being formed at the Paris Peace Conference.
And one of the enjoyable things about him is that he is a bit of a dandy, isn't he? He does quite like dress. He likes display. He likes the grandeur of his role. He likes turning up with his ceremonial dagger at events.
No, I think this is a normal dress of the emirs of Mecca. I mean, they had to also exude a certain aura, as it were, to tribesmen and to all kinds of people with whom they came in contact. So dress, attire, poise, as it were, was an important element of being a princely ruler. And I think the same thing probably applied on the international stage, that he needed to project an image that fitted the perceptions of what he should be like as a king.
Richard Evans, it's a fair point, isn't it? You have to try and stand out in Versailles. I mean, here is the world, they're both carving up the world, but there are all these huge egos and huge characters in the room.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, and the non-European powers tend to get marginalised. So the Japanese, for example, were shoved right to the edges, even though they were on the winning side as some allies of Britain. I mean, I got a very different impression of Lawrence from your two books. I think writing about Lawrence of Arabia, your book's called Lawrence in Arabia, because you have a number of different characters, which is a really original take on it, I think. But you do stand in a kind of Western tradition of writing about Lawrence. And you do see him as being very important, perhaps even more important than than others have seen him. Whereas I think, Ali, your approach is different. You see him as less important because for the first time you give the Arab perspective, and I think that's a terrific corrective to the long tradition started by Lawrence himself, of course, in Seven Pillars of Wisdom, of building him up as this great figure. It started with his own great ego, and people have tended to accept that.
No, that's true. But I do think that there was. I think that Lawrence was very much of a crucial player, even from the standpoint of that he became this liaison between the British authorities, the military and political authorities in Cairo, and the Arabs. You know, I've often thought, and I understand, like, from the Arab standpoint of, you know, of course, the Arab revolt, they want to own that narrative, and it has to be annoying that there's always this 5'4" British officer standing, you know, in center stage of it. But even to the point of how the Arab revolt could be funded and armed, Lawrence was indispensable in that. I was thinking of, like, Faisal or one of his lieutenants showing up in Cairo and asking the British authorities for 200,000 pounds of gold coins. It just wouldn't have worked. And so I think Lawrence did play this very crucial linchpin. Certainly, I think exaggerated to a degree in Seven Pillars, but I think that whole period of history would have played very differently if it hadn't been there.
Ali, is there a productive tension between you and Scott on the pecking order in this period?
I mean, I don't want to end up, debunking Lawrence. He's obviously an important figure, but he certainly embellished his account. And some of the key episodes in Lawrence's life that became, as it were, associated with his rise to fame. For example, Aqaba, the Battle of Aqaba, Tafila, the Battle of Tafila, the occupation of Damascus. There are very, very powerful counter-narratives, which are, I think, based on possibly more facts than the one that was presented by him, both in his dispatches as well as in the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Lawrence was an important figure, but he was not the critical figure that he made himself out to be, even though in a kind of self-effacing way. There are very, very, as I said, very powerful Arab counter-narratives by officers whose memoirs have come out recently that made it clear that in some of the key battles, Lawrence's role was at best secondary. For example, in Aqaba, the main hero of Aqaba, if you want to say, it was not Lawrence, but a man called Sharif Nasser, who had to assemble and motivate the tribes. We're talking about tens of thousands of tribesmen who had to be mobilized to fight these wars. Now, Lawrence could play a part, but not the only part.
Oh, and what about King Faisal? He starts out king as the first independent state of Syria. That didn't last very long. He's made king of Iraq, but do you see him, and some people have seen him more as a kind of British operative or, in essence, a puppet. I get the feeling you want to rescue him from this reputation a bit.
Well, I mean, he was never seen in his time, by the way, as a British puppet. I mean, amongst Arab national circles, even amongst the normal patriots of the period, he was seen to be a person on his own. There was always a tension between his role as, to some extent, dependent on British support, military support, financial support, and by his burning desire to establish an independent Arab state. So he was not a puppet in terms of being told what to do. He had to maneuver constantly, sometimes effectively, sometimes not so, in order to get around the various chains that were imposed on him.
Malu Halasa, someone who knows the Syrian perspective very well, what did Faisal mean to you?
Well, it was very interesting reading Professor Allawi's book, is that this idea that, we don't really, this is one of the first comprehensive biographies of Faisal's in English. And finally, we get the Arab perspective. I think that when it comes to the Middle East, from the perspective of the West, we're always thinking about T.E. Lawrence and 1001 Nights. And finally, at this time, these memoirs, biographies of Arab voices are coming to the fore. And I think that's one of the problems with the situation, the way the media and governments in the West deal with the Middle East, is that we don't have the Arab perspective. It's always through this veil or prism of the West or Western actors. And so now is the time that I think before the Arab Spring, too, that Arab voices are coming to the fore, that we're hearing their stories, their narratives, and that's sort of important at this time.
Scott, I noticed one figure you're rather critical of, which I thought was actually slightly surprising, although you make a good case, is Woodrow Wilson. Now, a lot of people look back and say Wilson was a man who understood the idea of self-determination, the concept that was so important to Faisal and to a lot of Arab nationalists and in many other parts of the world. And yet, you basically think he was a bit half-baked about it. He may not even have understood his own commitment.
Well, that's right. I think he was very half-baked. In fact, he stood after Paris. He addressed Congress, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he said, when I came up with this idea of self-determination for small nations, I had no idea how many there were, and with more coming along every day. I mean, the idea of an American president, standing in front of Congress and admitting that is quite astonishing.
It does remind me of a great clip I think I saw in the New Yorker, was the president saying, if anything I have said has caused me to be understood, I apologise. But the suggestion is that he really didn't know what he was unleashing with this idea, although it's perhaps one of the most powerful ideas in terms of geopolitics of the 20th century.
That's right. And what he did in the Middle East in particular was it's a little known footnote of history, but at Paris, when the British and French were all intent on carving up the region between themselves, Wilson stepped forward and said, "Well, let's go and find out what the people want." So he sent this fact-finding commission, the King Crane Commission, to the Middle East, interviewed Faisal, and it had these popular meetings all across the Middle East, and what everybody said, no matter what their secular background, was they wanted independence. And if they couldn't have American independence, they wanted an American governorship. They wanted an American mandate. The commission came back. That conflicted with what the British and French wanted. So the report just got buried, and it was not to be seen for 3 more years. So it was the effect of raising expectations that things might be different in the Middle East, and then walking away from it.
Ali, you have particular experience not only as a historian but as a serving politician in recent times about trying to put this nebulous concept of self-determination into action. You've been minister in the Iraqi government, I think, in 2 posts since the recent Iraq war. What do you take from the story of Faisal that you can apply to Iraq today?
Well, I started writing the book mainly in order to find out how the modern state of Iraq and also the entire state system in the modern Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire came about. And when 2003 happened, that is the invasion, occupation of Iraq, I thought that was the end of that state, the first state that came into being after World War I, and that we were going to start, as it were, with a tabula rasa and try to avoid or circumvent the errors that went into building the states after World War I. But it seems that really these mistakes do repeat themselves. There's a certain cyclicality. The arrogance of the people who are in power, the incompetence of those who are in authority, the reliance on excessive military force whenever an issue emerged, the weakness of the domestic political class.
You were drawing a direct parallel there to the aftermath of the recent war.
Yes, I mean it's not a one-to-one type of relationship, but I mean these things do tend to repeat themselves. And I think one of the core problems of the Middle East that we have now, and by the Middle East I mean the successor states to the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire, is the fact that the settlement that was, discussed very well in Scott's book, has proved to be really a disaster in the long term. I mean, it brought all kinds of entities into being that don't have the needed internal cohesion and stability to function as modern nation states. And if you look at all the states that came out of World War I, one way or another, they have been either destroyed, gobbled up, or in a state of civil war. I
understand the sort of desire to sort of blame the past, if I can put it in inverted commas, but if you throw it forward, what do you learn from it? Because one point that you make about Faisal was that tolerance and moderation, his great attributes really, as an Arab leader, were not necessarily always seen as strengths, and that's a very difficult message, isn't it, to apply to modern states today?
It is, but I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, apart from the normal characteristics of a leader, sort of strength and power and so on, you have to have a high degree of toleration, of tolerance, of wisdom, and decency, common decency. But apart from that, I think it also shows that there's some truth to the idea that a confederation of Arab states, a kind of mild pan-Arabism, is perhaps the only viable, workable alternative, I think, in the Middle East to the nation states that we have right now. So a kind of movement towards the idea, the principle that Faisal proposed or propounded in that period.
And what about the autocracy? What about that part of the tradition, which is there? You know, one can't wish it away. quite a high value is placed on it, isn't it?
It's there because the other part was not really implemented. So I think, Faisal sort of toyed with autocracy during a certain period in 1930 to 32, but he walked away from it. You just cannot run the Middle East this way, except you might end up with kind of dictatorships or terrible tyrannies that we've had before, or fragmentation. So
is that the lesson that you take from Faisal?
Yes, I started my life as a person who is not very favourable to Arab nationalism, but now I think looking at the last 30 or 40 years, I think there's just no other way except some form of confederation of Arab states.
Well, Faisal first died prematurely, perhaps poisoned, perhaps not, at the age of 50, just a year after the newly independent Iraq was admitted into the League of Nations. What if he had survived for another 20 years? Might things have turned out better and different? What difference would it have made today to the fortunes of Iraq? I can feel Richard Evans squirming across the table at the very thought of such speculation. He has his hands spread out here, possibly already in despair.
Not squirming at all.
His latest book, Altered Past, critiques the burgeoning fashion for counterfactual history. Richard, you're not a fan?
Not really. I think it has some limited uses, but I'm really interested in the way in which it's become really fashionable in the last 15 or 20 or so years, since the early 90s. We've seen an amazing outpouring of books. What if Napoleon had won the Battle of Waterloo? What if Britain had not joined the common market? What if Britain had not entered the First World War, and so on? And what if Michael Portillo become Prime Minister? There's a whole string of them about various people who did not become Prime Minister, what things might have been like.
They weren't all written by Michael Portillo either.
No, they're written.
But they are sort of tempting, aren't they? Yes,
but it's interesting because there weren't very many before the 90s. So what really struck me about this phenomenon was its novelty. There's occasional fantasies going back to the 19th century. The French were particularly fond of writing books about what the world would have been like had Napoleon conquered it. It would have been much better, of course, from their point of view. And so I started off by looking at why this is actually happening and what's still going on. I think it's got something to do with the end of the Cold War, the end of communism, the decline of Marxism, and more broadly the decline in the belief that history has a direction, and that's linked to the idea of progress. And I think the idea of progress has taken a lot of hard knocks recently with the rise of terrorism, the global warming.
There's a Whig view of history that things are gradually getting better.
Exactly,
it's been really severely challenged. But what's really wrong with writing counterfactual history? I mean, I can see that you can think it comes from a rather uncertain time, perhaps a bit of postmodernism, uncertainty after the fall of the Berlin Wall about the order. But do you think that it's harmless fun, or that it's actually bad history? A
lot of it is harmless fun and doesn't pretend to be anything else. It was a wonderful series of, I think, 40 counterfactual essays in the New Statesman by Dominic Sandbrook a couple of years back, which were terrific fun and they were not meant to be taken seriously. But there are historians who do take these things seriously and who say that, sort of extrapolating from one small change in the timeline, one small event, let's say Franz Ferdinand is not assassinated in 1914, and then you sort of spin out a whole series of further consequences. And that's where the alarm bells start ringing, because this small change is then made the basis for a whole inevitable sequence of events. If Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated, the First World War would not have happened. Then there would have been no Nazism, no Holocaust, and so on up to
I can
the
see
present.
It's questionable, but what's wrong with it?
Well, it's wrong because it does away with, well, first of all, it's wishful thinking. But 90% of all the counterfactuals are not really what if, but if only. If only these things had been different, then they would have been better. And that's something I don't think historians should get involved in, lecturing the past about where it went wrong and telling it how it should have done better. And then, as I was saying, it introduces this idea of inevitability into the whole counterfactual timeline. But of course, once you let the genie of chance out of the bottle,
then
you
other
can't stuff
chances.
it. Yeah, you can't stuff it back in again. Supposing Franz Ferdinand had not been assassinated in June 1914, he might have been assassinated a few months later, or some other cause might have happened to start the First World War. You just don't know. And that, of course, is why they're such fun, because you don't need any evidence for it. And history is really about finding out what happened and trying to understand it.
I wondered if anyone around the table wanted to stick up for counterfactual history. Malu, if you're looking at Syria at the moment, it must be very hard not to think, I wish this had gone a different way, and I wonder when that might have happened.
Well, it's not so much counterfactual history that Syrian activists are thinking about. What they're really thinking about, or I go back to there's a graffiti of a figure who has a keffiyeh on, who has a slingshot, and he's pointing the slingshot at power. And this figure was drawn by Mohammed Tayyib, and it comes out of Yarmouk camp, Palestinian camp in Damascus. And this figure symbolizes, according to Mohammed, it's really about the question of who gets to write history, and the contestation of who gets to write history from power. Can the small person, can the person on the street write history? How can nonviolent activists have a hand in history? So it's not about what if; it's about how to wrestle control from, for example, a state that controls the propaganda and controls all the media.
Yeah, but that's a sort of what if someone else wrote the history, I suppose, to an extent, counterfactually. What about the tension that lurks in counterfactual history, which is the role of the great individual? I know, Ali Allawi, that you've dwelt, at least in part, on how Iraq might have been changed if Allawi had lived longer. Do you feel that one ends up tilting too much towards the great individual, or is there a bit of a defence of that?
No, I think it is in defense of that partly. I mean, I don't want to go to the level of Carlyle and the sort of hero worship and all of that. But obviously, certain individuals in certain periods and certain epochs do have a colossal effect on the passage of history, and they have a colossal effect of events. I mean, Hitler, for example, it's inconceivable. In my mind, of course, I defer here to Richard, who's far more knowledgeable about this. Whether
historians always do that, but nonetheless, you have a slightly different prism.
I want to make a case that the way in which World War II, as it were, unfolded, especially the Holocaust, could that have possibly occurred without the central figure? And in the case of the Middle East, I think there is a case to be made that if a tolerant, accommodating state evolved in the Middle East that could have found a place for the minorities, especially the Jews, and we're talking here about the largest and the oldest Jewish community in the Middle East in Iraq, the division between Western and Eastern Jews, I think, would have possibly continued, and Zionism would not have been a pan-Jewish phenomenon, but would have been a phenomenon of Western Jewry.
Richard, isn't it a fair point that there are some individuals whose impact is big enough for us to say, yes, if they had been dispensed with earlier or gone into flower arranging, things really would not have turned out the same way?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, nobody could possibly dispute the significance of someone like Hitler or Stalin, but they were also people who operated within a specific historical context. Hitler believed in willpower, that willpower could overcome anything, and he discovered, of course, that it couldn't, because the German economy wasn't strong enough to outproduce in weapons and material any one of the other three major powers lined up against him. So willpower didn't work. And I think you always have to... I mean, the fascinating thing about history is to see the interplay of the individual and the context. And what too much counterfactual history does is to rip the individual out of the context and say, if only this individual had done this instead of that, or had been different, then everything would have been different.
But when you get a very specific... Sorry, Scott, I know you just wanted to pop in there.
I was just thinking, but I think in the very recent past we've seen there's a very clear counterfactual of the American invasion of Iraq. It's save for 529 hanging Chads in Florida. Al Gore was going to be the next president. If you keep September 11th as a constant, which I think it was going to happen in some form anyway. Certainly, any American president, Al Gore would have gone after the Al Qaeda in Afghanistan, but Iraq was George W. Bush's obsession. It's hard to imagine a Gore presidency would have gone into Iraq in that way. So I think that, again, save for those hanging Chads in Florida, we have a very different very different present now.
Yeah, I think you can do very short-term counterfactuals, and it's sometimes very useful to do that, to see what choices there were at the time, what were available, what's plausible, what's not plausible. And the problem comes when you start spinning out the counterfactuals over decades and over longer periods of time. And the more you do that, the more you ignore the fact that other chance events could have come in. So I think short-term counterfactuals can be quite helpful. We don't really know, of course, whether Al Gore would have gone into Iraq. The pressures from the American military might have been too big. It's a possibility. But what we do know is that the choice there was to go in or not. And George W. Bush, for very personal reasons, I think, to do with his relationship with his father, who previously, I don't want to get too psychological here, but
the relationship with fathers around the Middle East does seem to require
his
an entire
George Bush
team.
had beaten Saddam Hussein. He had to go on better. You can't say that of Al Gore.
That's right.
Well, let's turn to Malu Halasa, her book that she's co-edited with Zahir Umar and Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Front Line.
And Nawara Mahfoud. That's our other third.
There you go. And another contributor. An extraordinary collection of art, from political posters, graffiti, cartoons, strips, absolutely fascinating, very edgy cartoon strips and puppet shows. Be created among violence, war, and the chaos of Syria. Some people might think, gosh, of all the things that is going on at the moment, why collect art? Why pay attention to the art of Syria?
Well, the response of non-violent Syrian activists in the initial months of the uprising, the first 6 to 8 months of the uprising, was this artistic explosion. It was an explosion of free expression. Syrians talk about it as breaking the barrier of fear that they had for the past 40 years of the Assad family dictatorship. So there was the characteristic that marks the Syrian uprising very differently from what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia was that this creative explosion went across all levels of society. So it wasn't just the accepted intellectuals or artists who were making the artwork, or who were filming the short films, that the over 300,000 films that were posted on YouTube. It was normal people, some people who didn't have experience of being citizen journalists, some people who really didn't know how to illustrate, but suddenly people felt that they should express and say who they were and what they wanted to not only document what was going on in their country, because the official media was obviously giving an skewed picture, but also to express their aspirations for their country too.
And you mentioned earlier the graffiti, or the sense that history should be written, literally sort of written on the walls of a city under siege. What do you think the importance was in people's minds of that kind of act, which can seem so small but obviously took on a much broader significance?
Well, I think that when you are attending demonstrations and you're seeing, the secret police come in and it's violent right in front of you, or that you're in a village and the Shabiya come in and there are massacres right in front of you, and that it's not reflected or reported in the official media around you, people do take it upon themselves.
But that sounds like a response, whereas I thought your earlier claim was that this had helped spark or was a part of the revolution.
Well, it was a part of the revolution in the beginning, but it was also a response too. It was both. That people felt that they needed to express themselves. But this was the first time in a very long period that people were able to express themselves. And so by breaking what they call the barrier of fear, people really started producing a wide variety of different kinds of artwork.
Give us an example from Dera, for instance, where there was quite particular response.
Well, in Dera, the revolution, the Syrian revolution, started with graffiti. There was a group of schoolboys who had, graffitied on the wall that people want to topple the regime, or calling for the overthrow of the regime, and they were arrested. And they were tortured, and they were returned to their families. And when the people of Dera saw that was the beginning of these mass demonstrations that went across the country. So it wasn't just Dera; it was Hama, Homs, Idlib. It went across the country that people were protesting against this. So from there, with the response, the heavy-handed response to the regime, people started using, graffiti or these forms of very unofficial art happenings. For example, there was they took ping pong. Nonviolent Syrian activists took ping pong balls up to Qasum Mountain, and they had written various slogans on them, and they released the ping pong balls, and they went down the mountain, and some of them even went into Assad's presidential palace. And there was a report that I heard from a reporter saying that the security forces inside the palace, they were busy collecting the ping pong balls. They didn't want the president to see. So, I mean, so what...
It becomes yet another thing that needs to be covered up and kept away from the power. Ali Allawi, having lived through Iraq's recent history, when you hear that sort of story from Syria, do you think, well, this is an interesting sideshow, or do you think it is part of a country coming to consciousness about its condition and trying to do something?
I mean, I think there's an explosion of sort of protest art, dissident art, as it were, in the last few years after the Arab Spring. I mean, it's been there in Egypt, in Bahrain. There's a very powerful sort of street art movement. I think it's part and parcel of the as well the confusion that's taking the confused circumstances of the Middle East, and the way that youth in particular are trying to find a mechanism not only to express themselves but to fit into a system that seems to be extremely difficult to adjust to accommodate them and their aspirations, and not only those in power but those who want to reach power, the Islamists too. People have the same problem with both.
How much, Malu, is it a youthful response, because these tend to be rather youthful art forms, and yet you also in your work have works that reflect on the earlier massacre in 1982. So there is an extent to which sort of collages and things are put together to say, this happened, you've tried to cover it up, we're bringing this out now, over 30 years afterwards.
You could say that it's a youthful response, but there is a history that people have to deal with, and that they're unpicking, and they're, that people, old and young, are trying to figure out their own, responses to this history that was hidden. Or a history that people could only talk about in secret, or they could only talk about it in public and code. So it is but there was something I wanted to talk about that was sort of interesting to me, is that we're sort of discussing the origins of the modern Middle East, and I think for the younger generation in Syria that they don't look at historic, they don't think they go back to Sykes-Picot, or they're not thinking about the origins of the Middle East like that. That for many, because I was doing like a round-robin survey of the Syrians that I know, and a lot of the Syrians I know in their 30s were saying they felt that the origin for them of the modern Middle East is when the internet came into the country.
Scott?
In looking at Syria today, it was even reminded in looking at your book that another conflict it reminds me quite a bit of is the Spanish Civil War, and this particular moment it's in right now, where there's this tremendous fracturing among the rebels fighting against the status quo. And you mentioned a couple of times in your book of artists struggling with the dilemma of how much they can say outside of course, the Bashar Assad regime is the primary enemy, but how much do they talk about the internal divisions and the internal dangers within the opposition movement?
No, they are talking about that, and they're creating work about that. And there's a very interesting young comic strip collective called Comic for Syria. And they produced these flyers that were given out, that the activists gave out, that quoted the Quran about torture and prisoners. And so they're also trying to use artwork to influence FSA, Free Syrian Army units, not to torture. But also what's sort of interesting is that the Islamic groups, the Islamic fighters, they're arresting nonviolent activists, just as the regime is. Right. So among the community, they wonder if there's some sort of tie between the two.
Richard, is there any indication historically that this sort of reaction has an effect, if not in the moment, but in the medium term, it's sort of digging away at the certainties of people who've ended up part of the oppression?
Yeah, that was a question I was going to ask, actually. What's the effect of all this? Does it have an impact? Because it's wonderfully imaginative and diverse work, and it's a real eye-opener, I think, for those of you who have not read your book to go and look at it and see the extraordinary work that people are doing. But it's usually, under a tyranny, it's usually compensatory. If you look back at oppositional art, such as it is under dictatorships, it's always a kind of to reassure people. It's always to let off steam. It doesn't often have any real effect on the political situation.
I think that if history is always going to be the stories of the winners, particularly in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, they're going to history will look at Assad and they'll look at the Islamic fronts. And I think that's the problem with this whole history of violence of the Middle East, is that the violence and war always obscures the people. And the people themselves are never allowed to say. And that's one of the things that I feel really strongly. And this is like the third anthology of Arab voices that I've done. The first was from Beirut. The second was from Tehran. This is from Syria. I sort of feel that once you're looking at the region on a geopolitical level, the people disappear, the voices disappear. And I kind of feel that the strength of the Arab Spring, whether the so-called Arab Spring is the Arab winter or whether it's really worked or not, is that it allows for all these different narratives. We have a problem now with the way that the West is dealing with the Middle East. And I think I think this is due to the fact that the people's voices or the Middle Eastern voices are rarely heard. Or why are we waiting so long for this first comprehensive biography of Faisal, the first to come out?
So the voices matter in themselves. Very quickly, Richard.
It's not really true that people's voices are not heard. Reporters are constantly going into Syria and interviewing people who've had problems, who've suffered. Ordinary people get a say as well. And I don't think it's true either that history is written by the victors. It's often written by the losers. And your biography, I mean, in a sense, you're politically a loser. Your biography is an example.
Just cut you off there, Richard, but thanks to all my guests this morning. Richard's critique of counterfactual history, Altered Past, is published this week. Scott Anderson's Lawrence in Arabia and Ali Allawi's Faisal of Iraq are out now. And Syria Speaks, Art and Culture from the Frontline, co-edited by Malu Halasa, will be available in June. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe will be deep in love with Al Kennedy, David Sedaris, Lavinia Greenlaw and Simon Blackburn from Heartache to Narcissism. Thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.